My name is Pat Tully, and I'm the director of the Ketchikan Public Library in Ketchikan, Alaska. My talk is entitled, What Happens in the Library? It's fortuitous that this is taking place at the beginning of Women's History Month, since women are at the center of the development of the public library in Ketchikan and in many other places around the country. But I am getting ahead of myself. In this talk, I will provide a brief summary of how a library does its work, and then an overview of the history of libraries over the past 4,500 years, and finally a closer look at the history of Ketchikan Public Library. I'll conclude by talking a bit about why we do what we do. What happens in the library? Internally, every library performs the following functions. The first function is selecting and collecting books and other items. No library can collect all the books that are published, not even very large library systems such as the Library of Congress and Harvard University libraries. Instead, librarians carefully select the books, DVDs, and other materials based on review sources and their own knowledge of the interests and needs of the people in their community. Another function is cataloging items. Once a library has acquired a book or other item, basic information like author, title, and subject need to be entered into a catalog or index. Even very small public libraries have several thousand volumes, and it's important to provide basic information about each one. A third function is classifying items. Public libraries, including the Ketchikan Public Library, are first arranged into large collections like adult fiction, teen graphic novels, and children's picture books. These collections are by age group, format, and for children by reading level. At our library, each nonfiction book is assigned a Dewey Decimal Number so we can arrange them by specific subject on the shelves. For fiction, items are arranged by author. A fourth function is providing access to the collections. Once the books are classified and collection and classification labels are applied, they are shelved by subject and/or author, and classification information is added to the catalog record. A library patron can then search in the catalog by author, title, subject, or keyword and know what books we have and where to find them. And the fifth function is stewardship of items. The library is responsible for maintaining, tracking, and securing items in our collections since these are community assets. To do this, libraries have procedures in place to check out materials and to handle items that are overdue, lost, stolen, or damaged. These have been the core functions of library for literally thousands of years. Modern libraries also offer a variety of educational and recreational programs and other services. These are always related in some way to our core mission to provide informational, educational, and recreational resources for our community. Library history. The first libraries were established sometime during the second millennium BC. The earliest collections were clay tablets containing primarily business and governmental records dating from about 2600 BC. Going ahead about 2,000 years, Assyrian king Ashurbanipal reigned from 669 to 631 BC, and he collected a library of over 30,000 tablets from his own and neighboring kingdoms on subjects that ranged far beyond business and included science, medicine, history, and literature. Now, a collection this large had to be organized in order to find specific texts, and there is evidence that texts were sorted by subject and size and labeled on their edges with brief information about the text. They may even have withdrawn some older texts from the collection in order to make room for newer texts. Now, there's one thing that you learn very quickly when working in a library. Collection space is always at a premium. The Great Library at Alexandria in Egypt was established around 300 BC. Ptolemy II and his successors intended that the library would contain all knowledge. To that end, they sent out royal agents to collect any text they could find on any subject. When they had a choice between an older and a newer copy of a work, They were instructed to select the older copy, since that was more likely to be closer to the original. Famously, Ptolemy II decreed that texts on any ships that came into Alexandria be confiscated and copied by library scribes, with the originals kept by the library and copies returned to the ship. I love this. This is the ruins of the Serapeum in Alexandria. The Serapeum was a storehouse where library collections were moved when the main building was full. It's ancient offsite storage, just like our offsite storage in the Heckman building, to store some of the collections we don't have room for in the main building. The library at Alexandria eventually held over 500,000 scrolls, stored in bins by subject. The librarian Callimachus devised a classification system with 11 categories. Within each category, scrolls were sorted by author. Callimachus also created 120 index scrolls called pinakes, which listed basic information about each scroll and any question about its authenticity. Apparently, there was no great fire that destroyed the library at Alexandria. Between 48 and 33 BC, many works in the library were destroyed or dispersed during a war between Rome and Egypt. There's evidence that a much diminished library existed for a few hundred years after this, before it was finally destroyed in the 4th century AD. In ancient China, each dynasty kept records of their laws and history. During the Qin dynasty from 221 to 207 BC, the emperor attempted to destroy records of earlier dynasties to make it seem as though civilization began with the Qin. An early example of censorship, not preserving history but attempting to subvert it. Now, this attitude toward libraries as instruments of power was not continued when the Han Dynasty replaced the Qin in 207 BC. In fact, the Han Dynasty sought to restore and preserve historical documents whenever possible. Papermaking was also developed in the Han Dynasty, and this invention made it cheaper to create and copy works. In ancient Rome, many of Rome's emperors and wealthy citizens amassed large private libraries. Around the time of Christ, plans were made to establish a library that was open to the public, but nothing much came of it. As the Roman Empire's locus of power shifted from Rome to Byzantium in the first several centuries AD, libraries were established in Constantinople, where scribes and scholars studied and preserved ancient texts from Greece, Rome, and Asia Minor. Ancient texts were also preserved for centuries in Islamic libraries. After the death of Muhammad in the 7th century AD, his followers preserved his teaching in the Quran, which became a sacred scripture of Islam. Muslims were encouraged to learn to read in order to study and memorize the Quran. The Umayyad Caliphate established an early Islamic library that first contained only sacred texts and then expanded into collections of works on astrology, medicine, and military science. After adopting the art of papermaking from China, Islamic libraries began making cheaper paper copies of works from around the known world, translating these into Arabic for their scholars. Meanwhile, in Western Europe during the Middle Ages, monasteries collected and copied both sacred Christian works and those of earlier classical authors. Benedictine monasteries, in fact, were explicitly obligated to collect and preserve ancient texts by copying them. They did so and also added beautiful and elaborate illustrations, making their books valuable as works of art as well as of scholarship. In the later Middle Ages, universities began to be established throughout Western Europe, and scholars and students traveled to libraries in Byzantine Constantinople to study classical Greek works, and to Islamic libraries in Spain and elsewhere to study other ancient texts. The Byzantine and Islamic traditions of preserving and studying these texts sparked what was called the New Learning in Western Europe, which eventually led to the Renaissance. Hand copied and illustrated works in the Middle Ages were enormously expensive and valuable. As more monastic libraries opened up to scholars, The temptation among some of those scholars to steal, especially interesting and beautiful works for themselves or their institutions, was overwhelming. To discourage book thieves, some libraries used book curses, pasted into volumes or hung in the library. The following is a curse from the 10th century. If anyone take away this book, let him die the death. Let him be fried in a pan. Let the falling sickness and fever seize him. Let him be broken on the wheel and hanged. Amen. And this one is from a little bit later in the 15th century. Whoever steals this book will hang on a gallows in Paris. And if he isn't hung, he'll drown. And if he doesn't drown, he'll roast. And if he doesn't roast, a worse fate will befall him. The printing press came to Western Europe in the last part of the 15th century, and eventually libraries began collecting printed works as well as hand-lettered manuscripts. These printed works were different not only in their manufacture, but in their content. Sacred and ancient texts had been the only content considered worthy of the time and artistry it took to copy them. But printed works could be much more quickly and cheaply produced. Printed books were less beautiful, but much cheaper and often more useful. Books on architecture, agriculture, cooking, and other practical subjects became common. For those who could read, as more printed books and broadsheets became available in the 16th and 17th centuries, more people in Western Europe learned to read. For example, literacy rates in the United Kingdom in 1475 were estimated to be about 5%. Less than 200 years later, in 1650, over 50% of the people in the UK could read. And this carried over to the colonies in North America, at least for those in New England. Puritan settlers in the 17th century had a literacy rate for men of about 70%, both because of the emphasis on reading and studying the Bible and the importance of informed citizens participating in local town meetings and governance. Church libraries were available to parishioners in colonial America and in the early days of the Republic. The first public library in the colonies was created in Boston's Old State House in 1711, and another was opened in New York City in 1729. The books in both of these libraries were primarily religious. In 1731, Benjamin Franklin and his fellow members of the Junto, a Philadelphia discussion group that aimed at advancing their members' educations, established a subscription library for themselves. It was not yet a public library as we know it today, but it was a step in that direction. As America grew over the next century and a half, a variety of libraries were established. A few were public libraries funded by local taxpayers, but many more were established by wealthy benefactors or local churches. Circulating libraries were set up as a business. That is, for a fee, members of the public could borrow books from the library, and the owner not only maintained the library, but made a profit. Think of them as the Blockbuster Video of their day. Subscription libraries, as I mentioned before, were not a business, but rather a nonprofit organization. Members paid a subscription fee for the right to borrow books from the library, and the fees were used to maintain and staff the library. People in 19th century America were very interested in what we would call lifelong learning. And to that end, many cities and towns established a local lyceum or chautauqua. Experts and well-known writers of the day, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Mark Twain, among many others, traveled to various chautauqua to speak on important topics of the day: scientific, intellectual, historical, religious, and political. These are the kind of programs that are now offered by public libraries. Industrialist Andrew Carnegie, looking for a way to spend his millions to benefit society, had the idea of establishing public libraries. Between 1883 and 1929, Carnegie funded the building of 1,689 libraries in the United States and almost 1,000 more in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Carnegie explained it thusly: A library outranks any other one thing a community can do to benefit its people. It is a never failing spring in the desert. Carnegie set up a system by which he provided a building plan and the money to build. In exchange, the community committed to providing the land and ongoing funds to maintain the library once it was built. There are only two states that do not have any Carnegie libraries: Delaware and Alaska. At this same time, local women's groups grew in prominence and influence. Women had been getting together for many years to discuss literature and politics, but in the late 19th century, the focus of many women's groups became what they called municipal housekeeping. That is, extending their home duties to the care and improvement of their communities. The groups advocated for social causes such as temperance, child labor reform, education, and the establishment of public libraries. These groups provided strong local support for the libraries being proposed by Andrew Carnegie, when local governments were sometimes hesitant to agree to providing land and operating funds. As rowdy western frontier towns settled down, a public library was seen as an important step in becoming cultivated and respectable. Butte, Montana, for example, opened their first public library in 1893 with the support of city boosters who wanted to change the reputation of the city from a wild place of drinking, gambling, and prostitution. Speaking of which, we are finally getting to Ketchikan. As most of you know, Ketchikan was incorporated as a city in 1900. That same year, Forrest and Harriet Hunt moved to Ketchikan from Wrangell and started a small store here. The couple were very community minded. Forrest was elected to the Ketchikan City Council and then became mayor. The community eventually elected Forrest to the territorial legislature, where he served as president of the Senate for a term. Harriet was just as energetic as her husband. As soon as the family settled in Ketchikan, Harriet immersed herself in a variety of community organizations. She was also a keen amateur photographer and took hundreds of pictures of Ketchikan, many of which are now in the collection of the Tongass Historical Museum. These photographs provide an invaluable record of Ketchikan in the early 1900s. Harriet Hunt was a reader as well as a photographer. Her granddaughter Jane Church said she, Harriet, read a lot and was self-educated. If she was reading, she just forgot about the house. Shortly after her arrival in Ketchikan, Harriet and other prominent women of the city founded the Ladies' Literary Club. Members of the club discussed books they had read and how they might promote literacy and learning in Ketchikan. Ketchikan's first library was a large cedar bookcase built by Neil McElravy. This portable library was moved from one local business to another, whoever was willing to give it room. The Ladies' Literary Club wanted a more permanent library and proved effective advocates. In September 1901, they formed a library association. The names of many of their first members are familiar: Harriet Hunt, of course, Lizzie Heckman, Mrs. Swineford, and Mrs. John Stedman. Membership dues, which entitled one to borrow library books, were 25 cents a month. Association membership was limited to women. Men could join as affiliate members and borrow books for $3 a year, but they could not vote on association matters. In 1902, the Ketchikan Land Company offered the association a wooded lot downtown on the condition that the lot be cleared and the library placed there. A new library was built at a cost of $344 to clear the lot and $135 for the 20-foot by 40-foot building. It opened in September 1903. The association managed the library and maintained the building until 1908, when the city took over management of the building and the pay of a librarian, who was then paid $20 a month. The association continued to oversee the activities of the library. The library at this time and for several decades afterwards was a subscription library, not yet a free public library. Association members continued to pay dues of 25 cents a month, and they charged a modest fee to others in the community to borrow books. From the first, the library faced many of the same issues that face libraries today. In the spring of 1908, the association considered a challenge to a novel in the collection entitled 3 Weeks by Eleanor Glyn. 3 Weeks was published in 1907 and was the story of a young British aristocrat who has a short lived, 3 week, affair with an older married woman. Reviews of the book were generally negative. In the New York Times Review of September 28, 1907, the core of the objection was not moral, but literary. I quote from the review: Vice is a monster of such hideous mien that almost anybody will gladly pay Mrs. Glyn's publisher $1.50 for a look at it. We can all lay our hands on our hearts and assure the lady, with a sincerity as profound as her own, although in not nearly such elegant language, that we do not find fault with the pruriency of her story. What we cannot stand is its dullness. Despite this and other negative reviews, the book was enormously popular in the United States, perhaps in part because of the condemnation of the book by the Boston-based Watch and Word Society. The Banned in Boston label may, in fact, have led to the two movie adaptations of the book, one in 1914 and the other in 1924. Just as an aside, over 100 years later, in 2011, the novel 50 Shades of Grey had a similar fate. It was very popular as a book and a movie, despite its many literary deficiencies. Anyway, getting back to the Ketchikan Library Association's discussion of 3 Weeks, the minutes of their May 5, 1908 meeting read: There was quite a discussion over the book 3 Weeks as to whether we should allow it to remain in the library. A vote was taken, and it was decided to keep it. As you can tell from this list of new books published in the Ketchikan Miner in 1913, the library's collection included fiction as well as history, Alaska territorial law, pamphlets on education and fisheries, and tariff schedules. Before the internet, this information was exceedingly difficult to find, and Ketchikan's library was an important source for legal and governmental information. Across the country, in smaller cities and towns like Ketchikan, directors were often women. By 1923, 90% of library school graduates were women. Although librarians and library workers were often highly educated, librarianship was considered a fairly low status profession. Ketchikan's Library Association was a women's organization, and the directors were women as well. Mrs. Charles Depp served as the first volunteer librarian. The first salaried librarian was a Mrs. Bold, designated as Frank Bold's mother in 1906. Mrs. Ed Lake was a librarian for a time, and starting in 1914, Mrs. Julia Thompson took up the post, followed by Mrs. Swineford. When Mrs. Swineford passed away in 1927, Miss Esther Torrey became library director. In the books and movies of the period, librarians were stereotyped as introverts and spinsters. Actually, as one of the few professions open to women, it was a great way for a single woman to make a living. It's a Wonderful Life includes a prime example of this stereotype. I love the movie, but many librarians find this clip unintentionally hilarious. These are the two different versions of Mary in the movie, one married to George and the other an old maid librarian. I thought this was a pretty interesting item in the 1918 Juneau Empire. The influenza epidemic caused widespread disruption in Ketchikan, including the temporary closing of the library, just as our library was closed at times during the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 and 2021. In 1932, Harriet Hunt wrote a history of the Ketchikan Library for the newspaper, the Ketchikan Chronicle. In it, she described the library as it existed at that time. The library was out of space and, quote, were there more book space, many more good books would be on the shelves. 141 residents had library cards by the end of 1931, and the 1930 census recorded 3,796 residents in the city, and that year 13,119 books had been checked out. Hunt noted that the association realized that many children might not be able to afford the 25-cent monthly charge to borrow books, and they were discussing how they might provide free access to these children. Just a few years after writing this article, Harriet Hunt died at the age of 69. In her obituary in the Ketchikan Chronicle, she was praised for her forceful character, genuineness of purpose, tactful presentation, fidelity of ideals, and thorough honesty. We owe her and her fellow founders of the Ketchikan Public Library a great debt of gratitude. In 1935, the library moved into what was then the Ketchikan Public Utilities Building and is now City Hall. The city renovated 3 rooms in the building for a main book room, a reading room, and a children's library. Although the rooms were open to all, the library continued to charge users to borrow books. This changed finally in 1943, and the library did away with the member fee and became a public library, paid for by city taxpayers. Henceforth, all city residents could sign up for an account and check out materials without a monthly charge. The next year, the Ketchikan Public Library conducted a statewide survey to document the need for territorial aid in order to create public libraries throughout Alaska. It did not take long for the library to outgrow its 3 rooms in the Ketchikan Public Utilities Building. In 1945, the Library Association sent a resolution to the mayor and city council asking that they consider the needs of a suitable lot in the city and providing a building to house the library. The library was destined, however, to spend the next few decades in its City Hall location before the move to the Centennial Building in 1968, which it shared with the Tongass Historical Museum. These are some pictures of the library staff and programs during the Centennial Building years, and more pictures of the Centennial celebration, including the Book Cart Square Dance. After much controversy, a site for the new library was chosen, and we moved into our present building in January of 2013. Until 1985, the Ketchikan Public Library was the city's public library. Borough residents who lived outside the city would sign up for a library account by paying an annual fee. This changed in October 1985 when residents of the borough approved a non-area wide tax for library services. This enabled all borough residents, within and outside the city, to sign up for a library account without additional charge and with full access to library collections, programs, and services. Overdue books have long been a source of frustration for the library and guilt for library users. This 1947 United Press article, which was picked up by many newspapers around the country, described one such situation. Sometimes library books do get damaged, but not often by bears. Over the years, the Ketchikan Public Library has often granted overdue book amnesty, when library borrowers could return their books without being fined. But it took the COVID-19 pandemic to permanently eliminate overdue fines. Over the past several years, many libraries across the country have decided to stop charging overdue fines as a way to encourage people to come back to the library without the guilt of having old fines on their account. Between 2020 and 2021, the Ketchikan Public Library was closed at times due to the pandemic lockdown. So as a temporary measure, we stopped charging overdue fines. By 2022, pandemic restrictions had eased. But after reviewing the experiences of libraries that had permanently eliminated fines, we proposed to the City Council to follow suit, and the Council voted to do so. Eliminating overdue fines has minimized a financial and emotional barrier to access for many in our community. Being able to use the library without the hardship of paying fines and without the guilt of not being able to pay makes our collections, programs, and services more accessible to everyone. Library stories. In preparing for this talk, I asked current and former library staff members for their memories and stories, and I heard a lot of stories. Most began, however, with, "Please don't use this in your talk." But there are three stories I can tell. The first story, from the days before we managed orders electronically, is from Office Manager Kelly Johnson. So, way back in the day when we were using order slips instead of everything being digital, we printed out a 3x5 card for each book we ordered. These were placed alphabetically into a box at my desk since I was the one who placed the orders. If a patron wanted to put a hold on a book, staff were supposed to pull the card, add the patron's name and contact info to the bottom, and refile the card. Well, sometimes folks were busy, and what actually happened was they just put a post-it note on the slip. A popular title, like an upcoming John Grisham, might have half a dozen or more of these things stuck to the slip. I was in the box all the time. New orders were printed up, orders came in, and cards were pulled. I would grab the box to check on a title for someone, and eventually, at least once a year, I'd drop the thing. Those thin little sheets would jump and scatter like a startled flock of ravens, and I'd swear a blue streak. Then I'd gather them up and put the whole box back in order, but 9 times out of 10, at least one of those stupid post-its would have released itself from its card and be just laying loose on the floor like an orphaned baby seal. So I'd have a name with no idea what book they might be wanting, asking around the back room to see if anybody knew that patron and might be able to guess what they might have wanted. Sometimes I'd luck out and one of the staff would say, "Oh, yeah, they wanted such and such." But more often, there would be a bit of a debate if it was a known patron, which of the books coming in might have caught their fancy. And finally, I'd make the best guess possible. But I would wonder if when that hold finally came around, whether there would be a patron at the front counter wondering why they had placed that book on hold. The second story is from Bridget Stearns. It was an ordinary afternoon upstairs at the old Dock Street Library, September 3rd, 2003. That changed when the theft alarm system started to bray. An ordinary looking middle aged man had set it off, and he kept going out the door. Charlotte Glover, children's librarian, was at the front desk. She followed him out the door, calling, "Sir, sir, please stop, there's a problem." I noticed their interaction in the parking lot and went out to support Charlotte. The fellow would not engage with us and continued walking rapidly away toward the docks. By then, we knew something was wrong. We followed him all the way to Salmon Landing, trying to head him off. He finally stopped to shout at us to leave him alone. His coat swung open to reveal a book stuffed into his pants front. Aha! I nipped the book away from him. He then said a couple of things like, "I was going to bring it back, and I just wanted to read it. How bad is that?" He turned abruptly and headed back into the downtown. Charlotte peeled off to call the police. This was before cell phones were so common, and I continued the chase. He was by now more harried and anxious. What the heck had he gotten into? We galloped to the end of Creek Street and then huffed back to Stedman Street. Then up Stedman to the Salvation Army parking lot, where, thank goodness, several police cars converged and the man and the book were arrested. The man was charged with fourth-degree theft. He lived on a boat in Thomas Basin and had just motored into town. Nothing much happened for some time. He was ordered by a judge to write a letter of apology to the library, which he never did. The book, The Heart of the Sea, by Nathaniel Philbrick, made it back to the library eventually. Charlotte and I were invited to the annual Peace Officers Association banquet the following year and were given certificates of award for our efforts that fall day. Now, this story reminds me of a man a few years ago who regularly used the library but did not have an account. He would take a DVD disc out of its case, secrete the case in the stacks, and then take the disc home, and then finally bring the disc back a few days later. It drove us crazy. When we finally confronted him, he said contritely, "But I always bring them back." Our third Ketchikan Public Library story has to do with the Teen Advisory Group, or TAG, event about 5 years ago. TAG events are organized by a group of teens for themselves and other local teens and are usually held on Friday evenings from 6:30 to about 10 p.m. The story is told by TAG staff liaison, Kelly Johnson. We were having a TAG event, must have been at least 5 years ago, if not more, but we were in the new building. Anyhow, we'd been doing part of the event outside, and it was loud, and we moved it inside and did a batch of prize drawings. Gave out a big Lego set and a few other things, plus a few teens were picked to choose from the door prize books. We were gearing up for the next part of the program when a police officer walked into the building, frowning. I figured there'd been noise complaints. It had happened before, but one can never be sure, so I headed his way to see what was up. As I got closer, suddenly one of the teens dashed out of the event room and ran up to the officer. Dad, Dad, he's hollering, I won the Lego set. The officer looks a bit startled and glanced at me, and of course I was grinning huge. The teen asked, Did you stop by to see how it was going? This is so much fun. The officer, Oh, yeah, that's really cool. He looks up at me and says, But you need to be a little bit quieter. Oh, yeah, says the teen, we're done with that part. I nod, and the officer says, Okay, well, you have a good time. And because I can't help myself, I say, Thanks for stopping by. He just shook his head and headed out as his son raced back into the room. During most of its 4,500-year history, the mission of libraries hasn't changed all that much. But there have been a few big changes. One is how libraries meet the needs of our users. This has changed as technology has changed. From clay tablets to books, from DVDs to computers, the formats are different, but our community's need for information, enlightenment, and recreation is the same as it has ever been. Another change is that over the centuries, libraries have become more accessible to everyone in the community as more people have become literate and as democratic institutions require an educated, informed citizenry. This is not only accessibility within the library. Our outreach services librarian delivers books, DVDs, and programs to those who cannot come to the library. Some are homebound, some are residents of senior centers, and some are residents of the Ketchikan Correctional Center. I'm going to end with a different question. Why do libraries do what we do? The American Library Association, or ALA, is the professional organization for librarians in the United States and provides the guidelines and standards for libraries of all kinds. Back in 1939, the ALA adopted the Library Bill of Rights, which outlines our obligation to our communities and patrons. This has been updated several times since, most recently in 2019. It is worth reading in full. The American Library Association affirms that all libraries are forums for information and ideas, and that the following basic policies should guide their services. 1. Books and other library resources should be provided for the interest, information, and enlightenment of all people of the community the library serves. Material should not be excluded because of the origin, background, or views of those contributing to their creation. 2. Libraries should provide materials and information presenting all points of view on current and historical issues. Materials should not be proscribed or removed because of partisan or doctrinal disapproval. 3. Libraries should challenge censorship in the fulfillment of their responsibility to provide information and enlightenment. 4. Libraries should cooperate with all persons and groups concerned with resisting abridgment of free expression and free access to ideas. 5. A person's right to use a library should not be denied or abridged because of origin, age, background, or views. 6. Libraries which make exhibit spaces and meeting rooms available to the public they serve should make such facilities available on an equitable basis, regardless of the beliefs or affiliations of individuals or groups requesting their use. 7. All people, regardless of origin, age, background, or views, possess a right to privacy and confidentiality in their library use. Libraries should advocate for, educate about, and protect people's privacy, safeguarding all library use data, including personally identifiable information. So that's why we do what we do. Sometimes we lose track of this in our day to day work at the library, but it's worth remembering that we are members of an old and honorable profession and to strive to be worthy of our predecessors. Thank you so much for your attention and have a good day.